Husband disappeared after winning the lottery. 3 years later, his wife found a note in his garage. The champagne still sat untouched in the refrigerator. Emily Brooks ran her fingers across the frosted bottle, remembering the night they bought it. Just 7 days ago, her husband Daniel had burst through the front door. Lottery ticket clutched in his trembling hand, eyes wild with disbelief. We won. We actually won." His voice had barely risen above a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might make them untrue. She had laughed at first, thinking it was one of his accountant jokes, dry, delivered with such deadpan seriousness that sometimes only he found them funny. But when he'd shown her the numbers, matching perfectly with the evening's draw, the reality had crashed over her like a wave. $9.5 million. A fortune that would change everything. Now, standing in their modest kitchen, Emily stared at the bottle they'd never opened, at the celebration they'd never had. The house felt cavernous in its emptiness, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for Daniel to walk back through the door. But he wouldn't. She knew that now. The first 48 hours after his disappearance, Emily had been frantic but hopeful. She'd called hospitals, friends, relatives, convinced there must be a simple explanation. Perhaps he'd gotten cold feet about the sudden wealth, maybe he needed time to process. Daniel had always been methodical, careful. It was what made him an excellent accountant and a steady husband for the past 11 years. By day 3, the police had become involved. They'd taken her statement with professional detachment, their eyes scanning the living room as if cataloging potential evidence. Sometimes people behave unpredictably when sudden wealth enters the picture. "Miss Brooks," the older detective had said, his tone suggesting he'd seen this before. "Have you checked your bank accounts?" She had. There was nothing, not a single cent of the lottery winnings had been deposited into their joint accounts. Daniel's personal accounts showed normal activity until the day after the win, then nothing. His credit cards remained unused. His cell phone, according to the records the police later obtained, had made its last call to Emily the morning before he vanished, a mundane conversation about picking up dry cleaning. By the end of the first week, the story had leaked to the press. The headlines were immediate and merciless. "Lottery winner vanishes, leaves wife behind." Emily had become simultaneously invisible and hyper-visible. A curiosity for neighbors to whisper about, a cautionary tale for the evening news. The reporters camped outside her home, thrusting microphones toward her face whenever she dared step outside. "Did you have marital problems, Mrs. Brooks? Do you think your husband planned this? Were there signs?" The questions felt like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the privacy she'd always valued. Speculation ran rampant. Some suggested Daniel had been planning his escape for months, that the lottery win was just convenient timing. Others whispered that perhaps Emily herself had something to do with his disappearance. After all, who stood to gain more from his absence than his wife? But the police found no evidence of foul play, and the simple truth was that Emily had no access to the money. Without a prenuptial agreement specifying her rights to his winnings, she had no legal claim to the fortune that had vanished along with her husband. Daniel's family, always cold toward her, became openly hostile. His mother called one night, voice slurred with either emotion or alcohol. Emily couldn't tell which. "You drove him away," she'd hissed into the phone. "He was always too good for you." The friends they'd shared as a couple drifted away, uncomfortable with the scandal or perhaps secretly believing the worst about her. Invitations stopped coming, phone calls went unreturned. Even her closest friend Diane eventually stopped checking in, her final text a vague promise to catch up soon that they both knew was a lie. 3 weeks after Daniel's disappearance, Emily's boss called. The accounting firm where she worked as an administrative assistant was restructuring. Her position was being eliminated. The timing was unfortunate, he'd said, not meeting her eyes when he handed her the final paycheck. They both knew the real reason. Clients didn't want to be associated with the woman whose husband had vanished with millions. The financial reality set in quickly. The mortgage payment came due. Then the car loan. Without Daniel's income and with her own now gone, Emily found herself staring into an abyss of insolvency. The house they'd saved for years to buy would have to go. The life they'd built together was unraveling thread by thread. One night, nearly 6 weeks after Daniel vanished, Emily sat alone at their kitchen table, surrounded by past due notices and unanswered questions. She stared at their wedding photo, at Daniel's gentle smile and the hopeful light in his eyes, and felt something inside her harden. The tears that had come so freely in those first desperate days dried up. In their place grew a different kind of pain. Sharper, more focused. Daniel was gone, the money was gone, and she was left behind, not just abandoned but erased. Reduced in the public eye to the wife he left, a footnote in someone else's dramatic exit. That night, Emily packed a single suitcase and drove away from the home they'd shared, toward her late father's property in the hills. It would be the first of many steps into a new life, one she never wanted, but now had no choice but to build. The ancient furnace in her father's house groaned to life, pushing stale air through dusty vents. Emily wrapped herself in a threadbare blanket, watching as her breath formed small clouds in the chill of the living room. 3 months had passed since she'd fled her former life, seeking refuge in this forgotten place. A small, weathered cabin nestled among towering pines, 30 miles from the nearest town. The property had been sitting empty since her father's death 2 years earlier. Emily had meant to sell it, but something had always stopped her. Now, she was grateful for her hesitation. This neglected home had become her sanctuary, hidden from prying eyes and pointing fingers. Her cell phone, which she kept only for emergencies, buzzed on the coffee table. Another message from Detective Harlow. She let it go to voicemail, knowing exactly what he would say. The investigation was still active, but there were no new leads. Daniel had disappeared as completely as if he'd been erased from existence. His lottery winnings, all $9.5 million, had been claimed through a legal representative who refused to disclose his client's whereabouts. The money had been electronically transferred and then seemingly vanished into thin air, much like Daniel himself. Emily deleted the voicemail without listening to it. She'd filed 4 separate missing person reports in the first 6 months, each one met with the same result. Nothing. No credit card transactions, no phone activity, no border crossings under his name. It was as if Daniel Brooks had simply ceased to exist the moment he walked away from their life together. The local newspaper from town lay on the table beside her, folded to hide the small article on page 3. Lottery winner, still missing, investigation continues. The photo they'd used was an old one, taken at a company Christmas party years ago. Daniel's arm was around her shoulders, his smile gentle and genuine. The caption referred to her as the abandoned wife, a label that had somehow become her identity. Emily pushed the paper away and stood, moving to the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, coating the world in pristine white. Winter had come early to the mountains, bringing with it a silence that matched the emptiness inside her. In the beginning, she'd been consumed by worry. Had something happened to him? Was he hurt, or worse? But as weeks turned to months, worry had given way to a different kind of pain. The realization that he had chosen to leave, that he had orchestrated his disappearance down to the smallest detail, felt like drowning in slow motion. Daniel's parents had stopped speaking to her entirely after the 3-month mark. His father had called one final time, his voice cold and accusatory. He would never have left without reason, he'd said. Whatever you did, I hope it was worth destroying our family. The line had gone dead before she could respond, before she could explain that she was as bewildered as they were. Her own parents were long gone, her mother to cancer when Emily was in college, her father to a sudden heart attack just 2 years ago. There was no one left to defend her, to stand beside her against the whispers and speculation. Emily's savings had lasted 6 months. After that, necessity had driven her back into the world. The small-town library had needed an assistant, and the elderly head librarian Mrs. Keller had hired her without asking too many questions. Everyone deserves a fresh start, she'd said, sliding the employment forms across her desk. Whatever came before, it stays at the door when you enter this building. The job paid barely enough to cover utilities and groceries. But Emily had adapted. She'd learned to live simply, to need less. The scandal that had consumed her life in the city barely reached here. Occasionally, someone would recognize her name or face from the news reports, and the whispers would start again. But for the most part, she'd found a measure of anonymity in this quiet corner of the world. At night, though, when the house creaked and settled around her, the questions would return. Why had he done it? Had their marriage been so unbearable that vanishing seemed preferable to simply asking for a divorce? Had there been signs she'd missed? warnings she'd ignored. Emily moved away from the window and toward the kitchen, forcing herself to follow the routine she'd established. Coffee first, then breakfast. Small, manageable steps through each day. It was the only way she'd found to keep moving forward. The rain had started 3 days ago, a relentless downpour that turned the dirt driveway to mud and drummed against the roof in an endless rhythm. Emily had spent the morning at the library, shelving books and helping Mrs. Keller organize a children's reading program. Now trapped inside by the weather, she found herself staring at the garage door. The garage had been her father's domain, filled with tools and half-finished projects. She'd avoided it since moving in, unwilling to face the memories it contained. But the leak in the corner of the living room ceiling had grown worse with the rain, and she knew the toolbox she needed would be among her father's things. Taking a deep breath, Emily pulled open the heavy wooden door. The smell hit her immediately. Oil and sawdust and the faint mustiness of disuse. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, labeled in her father's neat handwriting. Fishing gear, Christmas decorations, tax records. She made her way carefully through the narrow paths between the clutter, searching for anything that might contain tools. An old stereo cabinet stood against the back wall, its veneer peeling away in places. Emily remembered it from her childhood. Her father had kept his record collection inside, playing Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald on Sunday mornings while he made pancakes. On impulse, she tugged open the cabinet door. The records were gone, probably sold or given away after her father's death. But as she started to close it again, something caught her eye. A slight gap in the wooden panel at the back. Curious, Emily pressed her fingers against it. The panel moved, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside lay a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with age. Written across the front in familiar handwriting were the words that made her heart stop. For Emily, read only if I'm gone. The handwriting wasn't her father's. It was Daniel's. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the envelope. Daniel's neat, precise handwriting, the same that had annotated their tax returns and written grocery lists, seemed to mock her from beyond his disappearance. For nearly 3 years she had lived with unanswered questions, and now, inexplicably, an answer had found her. She sank to the concrete floor of the garage, the envelope heavy in her hands. Rain drummed against the roof, creating a rhythmic backdrop to the thunder of her heartbeat. How long had this been here? Had Daniel somehow known she would end up in her father's house, or had someone placed it here after he vanished? The seal on the envelope was intact, the paper dry and unwrinkled. Emily traced her finger over her name, written in the blue ink Daniel had always preferred. With a deep breath that did little to steady her nerves, she broke the seal and pulled out several pages of stationery, the expensive kind from Daniel's desk drawer, reserved for important correspondence. Emily, the letter began. If you're reading this, then I've been gone long enough that you've given up looking for me in the obvious places. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's, slightly slanted to the right, with perfectly crossed T's and dotted I's. The accountant's hand, precise and meticulous even in emotion. I should start by saying I'm not finished. At least, I wasn't when I wrote this. I don't know what stories they've told about me by now, whether I'm a victim or a villain in the public eye. I suppose it doesn't much matter anymore. Emily's throat tightened. His words carried no warmth, none of the gentle consideration that had been so characteristic of their marriage. This was a different Daniel writing to her, cold, detached, almost clinical. I need to explain why I left. Not because you deserve an explanation, but because I need you to understand that this wasn't a spontaneous decision. It wasn't the lottery that made me leave. It was you. The accusation hit her like a physical blow. What was he talking about? Their marriage hadn't been perfect, whose was? But they'd been happy. Or at least she thought they had been. 3 weeks before I bought that winning ticket, I was using your laptop to check our joint investment account. You'd left your email open. I wasn't looking for anything, you know, I've never been the jealous type. But a name caught my eye in your inbox. Marcus Donovan. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Marcus, her college boyfriend. They'd reconnected on social media months earlier, innocent at first, catching up, sharing memories of mutual friends. I opened the thread. I know I shouldn't have, but something told me I needed to see what my wife was writing to her ex-boyfriend. I wish I hadn't looked. The emails went back months, Emily. You talked about meeting him when I was away at conferences. You discussed how unhappy you were, how you felt trapped in our boring life. Her hands were shaking so badly now that the paper rattled. Yes, she'd complained to Marcus about feeling stagnant, about wanting more excitement, but those had been harmless venting sessions. She'd never actually meant to act on those feelings. Had she? The last email was the worst. You told him you were waiting for your share before making any moves. You said once you had financial security, you could finally leave. Were you planning to divorce me, Emily? Or was the plan always for Marcus to help you take everything? Tears blurred her vision as she continued reading, horror blooming in her chest. The emails Daniel described weren't harmless. Read through his eyes, they painted a damning picture of a wife planning to abandon her husband once she had secured her financial future. The lottery win came a week later, $9.5 million. When I saw those numbers match, my first thought wasn't excitement. It was fear. I realized I'd just handed you exactly what you were waiting for, your share to take when you left me for him. Emily struggled to breathe. Had her casual complaints really seemed so calculated? She'd never intended to leave Daniel. The conversations with Marcus had been fantasy, escape, nothing more. But she couldn't deny the emails existed. She couldn't deny that she'd written things that, taken out of context, painted her as manipulative and unfaithful. So I made a decision. If you were planning to take what was mine and disappear, I would beat you to it. I contacted a lawyer the morning after the win, not our usual one, someone from out of state. I had the ticket verified privately and claimed the winnings through a blind trust. Every cent was moved offshore before the news even broke about the win. The methodical planning stunned her. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment reaction, this was calculated retribution. I set everything up so you couldn't touch the money. No joint accounts, no paper trail. I made myself disappear so completely that even if you tried to find me through the courts, there would be nothing to find. No legal name change, just a new identity built through cash transactions and careful planning. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of the life she thought they'd shared. All this time she'd imagined Daniel as a victim of a mental break, of foul play, of something beyond his control. Never had she imagined him as the architect of her public humiliation and financial ruin. I've watched from a distance as your life fell apart. I saw the news reports, the speculation. I know you lost your job, our house, our friends. And I waited to feel satisfaction, waited to feel that justice had been served. The final paragraph hit hardest of all. The irony is that in executing my revenge, I've become exactly what you apparently thought I was, someone capable of calculated cruelty. Maybe we deserved each other after all. Emily let the pages fall to her lap, too stunned to cry, too overwhelmed to process. Outside, the rain continued to fall, indifferent to the revelation that had just shattered what remained of her world. Emily stayed on the garage floor for what felt like hours. The letter spread across her lap. Night had fallen outside, the rain's intensity increasing with the darkness. Each droplet against the roof echoed the thundering questions in her mind. Why hadn't she deleted those emails? Why had she written them in the first place? The words she'd exchanged with Marcus, had they really seemed so damning? But there was more to the letter. With trembling hands, she turned to the next page. There's something else you should know, Emily, Daniel's handwriting continued, the pen having pressed harder here, leaving deeper indentations in the paper. Marcus isn't who you think he is. Emily frowned, confusion momentarily displacing her shock. Before I disappeared, I hired a private investigator. Not to follow you, to investigate him. Marcus Donovan has a criminal record spanning 3 states: identity theft, financial fraud, romance scams targeting vulnerable women. He's been convicted twice, served 18 months in a minimum security prison in Colorado. The room seemed to tilt around her. Marcus had told her he'd been living in Colorado, working as a marketing consultant, he'd said. He'd never mentioned prison. He's a con man, Emily. And you were his next mark. Those conversations about feeling trapped in our marriage, those weren't coincidental. He was grooming you, creating a wedge between us. The timing of his reappearance in your life wasn't random, it was calculated. He knew about our finances, knew exactly when to strike. Emily closed her eyes, memories reshuffling themselves like cards. Marcus asking casual questions about their investments. Marcus suggesting they meet for coffee when Daniel was at his annual accounting conference. Marcus making subtle comments about how someone as vibrant as she was deserved more excitement than a life with a numbers man. I anonymously provided all the evidence to the authorities the day before I disappeared. If my timing was right, they arrested him shortly after I vanished. You can verify this yourself. Check the records. Marcus Donovan, arrested February 2021 for financial fraud and attempted extortion. The date matched, almost 3 years ago, just days after Daniel had disappeared. She'd been too consumed by her own crisis to notice a small news item about the arrest of a con artist. I don't know if you were complicit in his scheme or just another victim. I spent months wondering if you'd fallen for his manipulation or if you were actively plotting with him. The woman I married couldn't have been so calculating, but then perhaps I never really knew you at all. Emily's chest ached as if physically struck. The Daniel she'd known had been thoughtful, measured, always giving others the benefit of the doubt. This letter revealed a different man, one capable of cold calculation and preemptive strikes. After I discovered your emails, I knew I couldn't just confront you. If you and Marcus were working together, you'd deny everything. If you were being manipulated, he'd find a way to twist the situation. The lottery win forced my hand. It was too much money, too much temptation, I couldn't risk staying. The letter continued, each paragraph more painful than the last. I've been living off the grid since I left. New name, new life. I move frequently, never staying in one place long enough to form connections. Marcus has associates, people who might come looking if they discovered how much money was involved. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm hiding from a threat that was invited into our lives by the person I trusted most. Emily's mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with the narrative she'd constructed over the past 3 years. Had she really been so blind? Had Marcus been manipulating her all along? The shame of her naivety burned alongside the sting of Daniel's accusations. If you're wondering why I've left this letter, why I'm reaching out after all this time, the handwriting faltered here, as if Daniel had hesitated before continuing. It's not forgiveness. I don't know if I'll ever forgive what happened, but I couldn't let you continue in ignorance of the danger he posed. Whatever you did, however you betrayed our vows, I wouldn't wish that man's predations on anyone. A strange sort of detachment settled over Emily as she read the calm that comes after shock, when the mind struggles to process too much information at once. Don't try to find me. You won't succeed. I've ensured that all legal avenues are closed. The money is untraceable, distributed through shell companies and offshore accounts that would take a lifetime to unravel. I've changed everything, my appearance, my habits, even the way I walk. The accountant you married no longer exists. The final paragraph was written in a sharper hand, the words more hurried, as if Daniel had been fighting against his better judgment to include them. The money's no longer the prize. The silence was. You would have left me for wealth. I left you with your own plan. Let that be lesson enough. This letter is the last piece of Daniel Brooks that remains in your life. Once you've read it, that life is truly over. Whatever comes next is up to you. The letter was unsigned, a final severing of connection. No closure, no sentiment, just a clinical exposition of betrayal and countermeasures. Outside, a branch scraped against the garage window, startling Emily from her stupor. She gathered the pages with mechanical precision, folding them along their original creases and returning them to the envelope. Her mind felt oddly blank, emotions too complex to process surging beneath a veneer of numbness. She stood slowly, legs stiff from sitting on the concrete floor. The rain had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence broken only by the occasional drip from the gutters. In that moment, Emily made a decision. She would not simply accept Daniel's version of events. She would investigate, verify, discover for herself what was truth and what was manipulation. Tomorrow, she would begin unraveling the threads of this twisted narrative. Tonight, she would sit with the knowledge that both she and Daniel had been keeping secrets, and that perhaps neither of them had truly known the other at all. The county records office smelled of dust and forgotten promises. Emily sat at a metal desk in the corner, surrounded by stacks of paper and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. She'd taken a personal day from the library, told Mrs. Keller she needed to handle some family business. It wasn't entirely a lie. 3 days had passed since finding Daniel's letter, 3 days of sleepless nights and questions that circled like vultures. Now she was hunting for answers, determined to separate truth from manipulation. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with sympathetic eyes, had helped her locate the criminal records. Marcus Donovan, Emily had said. The name bitter on her tongue. Arrested February. The file before her confirmed everything Daniel had written. Marcus Donovan, age 42, arrested February 15, 2021, exactly 1 week after Daniel's disappearance. The charges were extensive: wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit extortion. His pattern was consistent across 3 states: befriending or romancing women with financial assets, gradually gaining their trust, then emptying their accounts before disappearing. Emily's stomach churned as she read the investigator's notes. Marcus had targeted at least 7 women before her, all with similar profiles. Financially comfortable, married but dissatisfied, vulnerable to flattery and attention. 2 had lost their life savings, 1 had lost her home. A photograph clipped to the file showed Marcus in handcuffs, being led from a courtroom. His expression was defiant, none of the charming warmth she remembered. How had she missed it? The predatory calculation behind his interested gaze, the too perfect timing of his reappearance in her life. Found what you needed? The clerk's voice startled her. Emily nodded, closing the file. Yes, thank you. Outside, the spring sun felt harsh against her skin. Daniel had been right about Marcus. What else had he been right about? Had she truly been planning to leave? Or had Marcus planted those thoughts, nurtured a discontent that might not have blossomed without his cultivation? Her next stop was the bank, not her usual branch, but a larger one, in the city 40 miles away. She'd found a key in the same hidden compartment as the letter, attached to a small card with an account number written in Daniel's hand. The banker who greeted her was professionally courteous, checking her identification twice before leading her to a private office. This account was established 3 years ago, he explained, passing her a statement. It's an anonymous trust, but you're named as the sole beneficiary. The activation date was programmed into the system, exactly 1 week before you came in today. Emily stared at the balance. $250,000. Not millions, but more money than she'd seen since Daniel vanished. Was there a message with the account? She asked, her voice barely steady. The banker nodded, retrieving an envelope from a folder. This one was sealed with the bank's logo, not Daniel's handwriting, but she knew what she would find inside. Alone in her car parked behind the bank, Emily opened this second letter. The paper was different bank stationery, not Daniel's personal supply, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Emily, it began. By now you've confirmed what I told you about Marcus. I hope that brings some clarity, if not comfort. She took a deep breath, steeling herself from more recriminations, but the tone of this letter was different. The money in this account is yours. No strings, no traps. It's not the millions from the lottery. That money is gone, distributed in ways that ensured neither of us could access it again. Think of this as severance for a marriage that was already ending, just not on the terms either of us expected. The calculated cruelty of the first letter was absent here. In its place was something more complex. Not warmth, exactly, but a resigned acceptance. I don't know if you were actively planning to leave with Marcus, or if you were just fantasizing about an escape. Maybe you were his victim as much as you were my betrayer. After 3 years of distance, I've come to accept that the truth probably lies somewhere in between. Emily leaned her head against the steering wheel, tears threatening but not falling. What would she have done if Marcus had asked her to leave with him? Would she have gone? The honest answer scared her. This money is enough to start over, but not enough to attract the kind of people who might harm you. Use it wisely. Buy a small home. Finish the degree you always talked about. Find a purpose that's yours alone, not defined by me or anyone else. The generosity felt like its own kind of punishment. A reminder that Daniel, even in his anger, retained a fundamental decency she had perhaps taken for granted. I won't contact you again after this. I've made a new life far from here, with people who know nothing of lottery tickets or betrayals. I hope you find your way forward too. The letter was signed simply D. Not Daniel, not her husband, just a single initial from a man who now existed only in memory. Emily sat in her car until sunset, watching people come and go from the bank, each absorbed in their own financial concerns, their own private dramas. None of them knew that just a few feet away, a woman was reconstructing the narrative of her life, piece by painful piece. That evening, she returned to her father's house, walking through the empty rooms with new eyes. She'd been living like a ghost for 3 years, haunting the edges of a life she couldn't fully claim. Daniel's revelation had wounded her deeply, but it had also, strangely, set her free. In the garage she found the hidden compartment again, running her fingers along its edges. A perfect hiding place. Her father had probably built it to store valuables, never imagining it would one day conceal the truth about his daughter's marriage. Emily placed both letters inside, along with the bank statements. Then she closed the panel and pushed the cabinet back against the wall. The past belonged here, hidden but not forgotten, a lesson preserved in wood and paper. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell on a dusty photo album on one of the shelves. She pulled it down, opening to a random page. There she was, 22 and radiant, standing beside her father at her college graduation. Her eyes shone with possibilities, with futures not yet chosen. "Now you have what you wanted, earned differently," Daniel had written in his final message. Tonight, as she stood among the remnants of multiple lives, Emily finally understood what he meant. Freedom had come, not through betrayal or lottery tickets, but through loss and revelation. An ending had been forced upon her, but the beginning that followed would be entirely her own. The small cottage sat at the edge of town, its freshly painted blue shutters catching the morning light. Emily stood in the driveway, keys in hand, still not quite believing this place was hers. 3 months had passed since she'd found Daniel's letters, since the truth had rewritten her past and opened a door to her future. She'd purchased the cottage outright, using a portion of the $250,000 Daniel had left her. No mortgage, no debt, just a modest home with a garden that needed tending and a front porch wide enough for a rocking chair. The realtor had been surprised when Emily paid in cash, but asked no questions. In a town this size, people respected privacy more than they craved gossip. "Need help with those boxes?" her neighbor called from across the fence. Mrs. Winters was in her 70s, with bright eyes and a voice that carried farther than her petite frame suggested possible. "I'm fine, thank you," Emily replied, lifting a box of books from her car. "Just a few more trips." The older woman nodded, returning to her roses. She knew nothing of lottery tickets or missing husbands. To her, Emily was simply the new librarian who'd bought the Henderson place, a quiet woman with a polite smile and private ways. Inside, the cottage smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. Emily had chosen each color deliberately: warm ivory for the living room, sage green for the kitchen, a peaceful blue for the bedroom. No trace remained of the neutral beiges that had filled her home with Daniel, the safe colors they'd compromised on because he found her preferences too bold. She unpacked methodically, arranging books by author, stacking plates in cupboards, hanging curtains she'd sewn herself during quiet evenings at her father's house. Each object found its place in this new world she was creating. A world built entirely to her specifications, undefined by crisis or shame. The local library had offered her a full-time position last month, impressed by her dedication and the children's reading program she developed. The salary wasn't substantial, but it was enough. Combined with careful management of Daniel's parting gift, she could live comfortably for years to come. As twilight softened the edges of the day, Emily sat on her new porch, a cup of tea cooling beside her. 3 years ago she couldn't have imagined this peaceful solitude. She'd been defined by her marriage, then by its spectacular collapse. For so long she'd been poor Emily Brooks, the abandoned wife, the victim of a modern mystery. Now, she was simply Emily, not Daniel's wife, not Marcus's target, just herself, with strengths and weaknesses entirely her own. She'd told no one about the letters or the money. Daniel's family had tried to contact her once, after learning she'd moved. His mother had called, voice carefully neutral, asking if there had been any news. Emily had replied truthfully that there was nothing new to report. The conversation had been brief, civil, ultimately unsatisfying for both parties. What would they think if they knew? Would they blame her more, or would they find some comfort in knowing their son had chosen his disappearance, hadn't met with foul play? Emily had decided it wasn't her story to tell. Daniel had made his choice to vanish, to punish, eventually, to provide a measure of restitution. she would respect the finality of his decision. As for Marcus, she'd learned he was serving a 7-year sentence. The prosecutor had built a case around multiple victims, Emily included, though she'd never been called to testify. Marcus's web of manipulation had been more extensive than even Daniel had realized. In his prison photo, Marcus looked older, harder, all traces of the charming man she'd known erased by institutional lighting and the weight of consequence. She sometimes wondered about those emails that had triggered everything, the careless words she'd written, the flirtation she'd indulged. Had she truly been contemplating leaving Daniel? Or had she simply been seeking validation, an escape from the quiet predictability of their life together? The honesty of hindsight was both brutal and liberating. There had been something missing in their marriage, a restlessness she'd never fully acknowledged, even to herself. Emily sipped her tea, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Whatever she might have done, whatever choices she might have made if circumstances had been different, that timeline had been severed the moment Daniel read those emails. There was no use wondering about paths not taken. The only road that mattered was the one stretching before her now. A cool breeze stirred the wind chimes hanging from her porch, creating a melody both melancholy and sweet. Emily closed her eyes, listening to the music of this new life. Tomorrow, she would plant lavender along the garden path. Next week she would begin the online courses for the degree she'd abandoned years ago. Small steps, each one carrying her further from the woman who had once defined herself through someone else's eyes. Daniel was out there somewhere, perhaps sitting on his own porch, listening to different wind chimes, living a life equally transformed by betrayal and choice. Emily hoped he had found some measure of peace, that the bitterness that had driven him to such elaborate revenge had mellowed with time, not for her sake, but for his. The darkness deepened around her cottage, wrapping it in gentle shadows. Inside, lamps glowed in windows that faced the road, creating a picture of domestic tranquility for any who might pass by. No one would guess at the complicated history contained within these walls, at the thousand invisible threads connecting this peaceful present to a tumultuous past. Emily rose, gathering her empty cup. The last chapter of their story had been written not with confrontation, but with silence. Not with reconciliation, but with acceptance. The lottery had changed everything, yet nothing at all. The weaknesses in their marriage had existed long before those numbers were drawn. The winning ticket merely accelerated an ending that might have come anyway in its own time, with its own pain. She paused at the threshold of her new home, looking back at the darkened garden. The past was sealed away now, like the letters hidden in her father's garage. She would not forget, but neither would she allow memory to overshadow possibility. Daniel had disappeared, but Emily had found herself in grief, in shame, and finally in the quiet dignity of moving forward. Stepping inside, she closed the door on the night, on the ghosts, on the woman she used to be. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own quiet victories. For tonight the silence was enough, a silence no longer filled with questions, but with the gentle certainty of a life reclaimed.